Hello, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started because we have so much excellent ground to cover today. Welcome. My name is Pam Schwartz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Orange County Regional History Center in downtown Orlando. Big thank you to everybody taking the time to join us today. We're very excited to welcome you to the second annual Women's History Celebration, in which we'll be honoring Mabel Norris Reese. Thank you for joining us virtually this year. I've heard many people mention that coming to the inaugural Women's History Celebration last year was one of the last public things that they did before the quarantine and shutdown due to the pandemic. So though we are doing this a little bit differently, and we would love to be in a room joining with you all, we do our best to make lemonade, right? So glad to be having a virtual event this year, and that we can still meet together in this capacity to honor a magnificent woman in history. We're glad to have you all back with us, and also welcome to any new individuals joining us. We definitely want to take time to welcome our elected official, Commissioner Nicole Wilson. I'm not sure whether we have anybody else additional joining us today, but also welcome. Feel free to let us know in the chat if you are here. A big thank you to Universal Orlando for sponsoring this event, and also to the League of Women Voters, who continue to be an incredible partner of the Orange County Regional History Center. First of all, we should go over the rules of Zoom. And most of you are probably know what to do by this point. We've all been doing it for a while. Because this is webinar style, our visitors, our people enjoying this, won't have to worry about muting, but we will be having our panelists both mute and turn their cameras off when they're not speaking, just to be sure. But we really do want you all to engage in conversation in the chat box. So if you're new to Zoom, just at the bottom, you should see a little box that says chat. Feel free to share there your own thoughts, your own comments, and make sure to be dropping questions in as well, as we will we'll be saving some time at the end to kind of go through some of those questions and to go talk about as many as we can. So I don't want to take much time today to speak, as we have so many incredible speakers planned to talk today. But I do want to share the importance of this event. The past year has brought so many new challenges for women and mothers, caretakers, first responders, and change makers, even as vice president of the nation, right? We've all faced those challenges and have faced them fiercely, I think. So may today be about accepting challenges and learning from the strengths of women in history and all of the strong women around us. Last year, if you were with us, you might recall that we started a new initiative to create an endowed paid women's history internship. That is to have a paid intern at the History Center doing a project solely about and elevating the stories of women in history. Several of you, along with a very generous major donor, have allowed us to list our first official opening. So that is actively accepting applications, and we'll be dropping a link to that in the chat if you know somebody or you yourself would be interested in applying for that internship. So our first round of the Her Story Women in History internship in honor of Jean Edge Evans and Bickley Wilson, named in honor of two fierce women who've made a difference. And we are fortunate to have at least one, if not both, of their daughters joining us today for this presentation. Again, we'll drop a link in the chat about that internship posting, but we'll also drop a link in case you'd like to be part of continuing to make this internship a possibility. The idea of endowing an internship is that it can start to fund itself. So if we are able to raise enough money, we'll be able to continue doing this really good work into the future, and to be able to give this opportunity to so many individuals who might not be able to take an unpaid position at a museum or anywhere else. So please do feel free to donate if that's something you're passionate about, is raising those stories up and also giving individuals opportunities like these. We want to be able to uncover and shout out loud the importance of all women have done and continue to do in the betterment of our region. So now I'd like to pass off and welcome Angela Lagos, who is the Assistant Director, Angela Lagos, who is the Assistant Director, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with Universal Parks and Resorts as our sponsor. Thank you so much to Universal for making this a possibility.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you to each of you for making the time to join today. We really across Universal Parks and Resorts, but in particular, starting with our Universal Orlando team, when we think of our community relations team, our government relations, who have really joined with us to make sure that we can be aware of, be a part of, and really help amplify these stories across our community. So we are thrilled, Pam, to continue this partnership with you in the History Center. In fact, we are actually thrilled that through the great work of the Orange County MLK initiative with our fine mayor, Demings, and also with the great work of Rhonda Robinson, Shally Wong, and all of the team, that there's a lot of great work and stories. But to go back to today and what our own women at Universal do, we're making history every day of the year. In fact, we're celebrating Women's Her Story Month every month of the year. And when we really look at what we're going to learn today, the legacy of what Mabel has brought to us and to really uncover all those stories. You said it beautifully, Pam, but we were really excited. You saw some of the slides there as you came in, that our women's network and all of our 7 resource groups really are focused on amplifying those voices. So when you hear this distinguished panel, think of those stories that are going to resonate with you. And it really starts with Mabel asking those questions and digging deep and finding out. And so we as a company can value that, because inquiry, creativity, belonging, amplifying, and advocacy are all about what we do as a diversity, equity, and inclusion focused organization. And we also think of on the news side of the business, connected to our Comcast NBC Universal side of the family. So when we think of groups like NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, or Asian American journalists, or Hispanic journalists and women, there are always going to be people that are going to stand among the crowd to say, wait, what about this? And let's take a closer look. So we're happy to partner. We're very honored to sponsor this. And again, with our community relations and government relations team, last year we were all together for one of the last events when we were honoring the great legacy of Mary McLeod Bethune. So congratulations on this session. And I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful panel and join our Universal family team members in learning today. So thank you.
Thank you again so much. We really appreciate that. And the History Center can't thank enough everybody for all of the sponsorships and partnerships that we're so fortunate to have. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker today. It's somebody I can't wait to meet, maybe not in person, but at least, over the phone and then talk a little bit with. I'd introduce Lauren Ritchie. So Lauren is a former Lake County columnist for the Orlando Sentinel. She retired in 2020 after 41 years as a journalist. That is a long, dedicated time. A writer who's focused on loyalty and accuracy. She came to appreciate how much of a privilege and an honor it is to be trusted to tell the stories of people who live them. That's something we at the History Center feel very passionately about ourselves. So it is indeed important to tell those stories. So welcome, Lauren. We'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Pam. I am tickled to be here today because I almost wasn't. My computer decided to go on the blink last night, and that was really exciting. And it happened to eat when it went. It ate my remarks for today. So you're getting the unfiltered Lauren, direct from my friend Parker Lovell's horse barn in 40 degrees here in North Carolina. And I'm sitting in her office. So you're right outside. There's a farrier working on some feet. So you're going to hear some clanging. You might hear some horses whinnying. You might hear some dogs barking. And I apologize in advance, but this turned out to be better than nothing. So here we are. I have something to confess right off. But first, I want to say that I'm happy to be interrupted. So if you just unmute and ask, I'm fine with that. If you have something you'd like to hear. First off, I have to confess that I knew nothing about Mabel Norris Reese in the 30 or 40 years that I've lived in Lake County. She wasn't taught in school here. She wasn't recognized by people. She wasn't remembered. I vaguely heard one time that there was this sassy woman in Mount Dora who had gone up against Willis McCall. And I thought that was pretty cool, but nobody knew very much about her until Gilbert King wrote about her in his book, Devil in the Grove. And in that book, Mabel Norris Reese was not the main character, of course. I mean, the book exposed what Willis McCall, the 40-year sheriff up here, did to basically keep African Americans down as much as he possibly could. And it just went farther than that. There were murders, there were lynchings. It was a nightmare. And the thing about Lake County is no one talked about it. It was cool to keep quiet. And the thing that makes Gilbert's book so intensely interesting are the layers in it that describe what's going on and where. And one of these layers was Mabel Norris Reese. And you could watch her through this whole book as she started out as a supporter of Willis McCall's. The rumors about Willis were just way too crazy to believe. And so people just didn't really, they talked about them quietly if they talked at all. And they were so bizarre. Who would imagine that somebody in charge of upholding the law would send their deputies out to light fires in a home? It just seems too much like a movie. But the most interesting thing about it is you can watch Mabel through this book of Gil's come to realize slowly, piece by piece, that all of this stuff was true and that there was even more than anyone could imagine. And the other thing about Mabel, she was a small town journalist. City council, church socials, and yet once she figured this out, she hung on to it. And to me, that's just been such an inspiration. It just doesn't matter where you are. You can be in New York and work for the New York Times, or you can be anywhere and do what Mabel did, or at least a piece of it. She was a very ordinary person who slowly came to change her mind about Willis McCall, and then developed this hardness, this hard shell that allowed her to continue to work and continue to expose the things that Willis McCall did, particularly to the Groveland Four, the 4 young Black men who were accused of the rape of a 17-year-old girl who was married. And of course, you have to look at the culture at the time, which was a very racist culture. But you have to wonder how it got so bad in Lake County. How did that come to be? And I think Gilbert's book answered a lot of that. But what happened to Mabel Norris Reese is astounding. Her dog was poisoned. Her home had a cross burned on the front lawn. Her business was firebombed. And in the end, they ran her out of town. And she went to work for the Daytona Beach News Journal, where she continued to keep writing about Willis McCall and the injustices that he was perpetrating in Lake County. I've often wondered how, I know that when I wrote stories about injustice, I was focused very carefully on this injustice and getting every bit of it right. And I'm going to guess that she was probably the same way, that she was focused very closely on the story at hand, and she didn't decide to, try and look beyond that at that time. I don't blame her. I mean, it's enough to get a story that no one wants you to write about. I mean, the culture at the time was so white, so male. You have to realize this was right after the First World War, at a time when sociologists called it momism. You know, people just wanted their lives to come back to normal. You know, get married, have families, get a good job, watch your children grow up and do better than you did. These are all great goals. And Mabel was focused so differently than these other women. So she was not only fighting a culture that was all over the country, but she was fighting a specific culture where white guys did what they want and then intimidated everybody else to just shut up and keep it to themselves. And yet she managed to write it and to keep writing it. And that has been just the most incredible, for me, incredible thing that she did, when you put yourself in her spot. And you know, I guess we all know this, but it's hard to admit you were wrong. And I don't like doing it. You know, occasionally I've had to do it. But she was wrong in such a big way. And of course, it wasn't really her fault. I mean, she, like I said, this whole culture conspired to keep silent. And I think that Mabel probably never realized that that culture has had such a lasting effect on Lake County. And that's because the culture is often very much the same there right now. White guys say what they want and tell everybody else to keep quiet. You know, sometimes racism is, and I think Gil can tell you this, sometimes racism is openly embraced. I know when Gilbert first started looking at this situation as a, you know, as a possible book, there were people that called the library where he was researching and threatened him, like, get out. This is none of your business. This is our business. We don't want some Yankee down here finding this out. And that culture lives on today. I'm not sure what else you would like me to say. Pam, do you have anything in particular that you would like me to discuss, or are there people out there who would just like to talk about Mabel?
Well, you know, I was just putting in for the chat, so people do please put any questions you might have for Lauren in the chat box, and we'll address some of those at the end. But I know one thing I would ask is, you know, having worked in Lake County, and you talked about this a little bit, but I would love personally if you would share a little bit of your own experience and what you came up against, and all the good work, what you came up against in all of the great work that you did across 41 years, and maybe share a couple things that really stick out to you. I read your column in the paper, and every step of the way I was like, I need to meet this person. I need to actually, you know, try to do an oral history, because everything is just so fascinating. So I'd love if you would share a little bit of your own personal experience, because I really do feel you're sort of a continuing legacy of the work that Mabel was trying to do.
Oh, I wish. I wish I was. You know, one of the things that has been the most horrific in my career, and it happened right, and it wasn't an event, it was a process. And sometimes the processes sneak in there, and it takes you a while to figure out this is a horrific event or process. And it was how the Historical Society up in Lake County decided to try and get a statue of a Confederate general to come to Lake County. And I remember sitting there just going, what? It was just unbelievable that in this day and age, people who claim to understand history hadn't the smallest clue about, about what's painful to other people. And they spent, several years working on this. So one of the county commissioners, she went way out of her way, wrote long screeds on Facebook and memos explaining to these really dull-witted people who felt hurt by this, that this is a learning tool. And basically, y'all need to get on board because this is a learning tool and we're all going to learn something from it. And you're just sitting back there going, no, this is no learning tool. This is a place where segregation lived on until the schools segregated in the 1970s. And your parents went to segregated schools. I mean, how do you explain to people that this is not normal? This is not how the rest of the world does this. And it was such a fascinating divide to watch occur, especially against the context of President Trump, who, certainly said, people basically need to grow a skin and, get past this sort of thing. But how in the world can you grow a skin when your historical society is trying to bring a 6-ton marble statue that's 10 feet tall without the base into that it would just overwhelm a tiny historical society like the one in Lake County. Thankfully, this thing is kind of shaken out. And they've decided that they're, in the end, that maybe this wasn't the best of ideas. And it's like, oh, thank heavens. But you know what? They don't feel it. They don't have a gut sense of why this was so revolting to so many people. I can see a question on the chat that says, do I think Lake County will accept the statue of Mary McLeod Bethune? Yes, I do. I don't think they had anything, it's not like they want to just wipe out everyone of a certain color or a color not like theirs. They're okay, I think, on the whole. It's just when, you tell them that their hero is not a hero. Their hero was a traitor to this country who then ran away to Mexico and stayed hidden for some months until he negotiated a safe way to come back into the country. This was particularly revolting because this Confederate general that they wanted to put the statue up, he had no connection to Lake County. And, their argument was, well, at one point, Lake County was part of St. Augustine, which was this fella's hometown. Well, yeah, St. Augustine's 2 hours up the road. We've got no connection to this fella. It's like, get him out of our historical society, and the expense and for this tiny society that can't even pay a person to be there during the day and answer the phone. County commission paid for it. And that made all the difference in the world, because you can squeeze elected officials where it's a little harder to squeeze people who think the Confederacy should be revered.
Yeah, I think, being on that side of the business, the museum side, that's like a whole other conversation we could have about that decision-making process and what it should look like to accept objects and artifacts. So we do have a few more questions. I'm going to hold those to the end. So we're going to move on. Thank you so much, Lauren, for sharing a little bit of your own thoughts. And so we'll come back. But do you want to introduce our next speaker, Gary McKechnie? He was born in Maitland and has lived in Mount Dora since 1992. Through Gilbert King, who I believe has also joined us for the presentation today. Thank you, Gilbert, for coming on. Through Gilbert's King's books, he learned of Mabel Norris Reese and, duly impressed, formed the Mabel Norris Reese Tribute Fund. The drive raised funds to commission a sculpted portrait of Mabel that has been bronzed and will soon be unveiled in Mount Dora. So Gary's going to spend a little time explaining the background of that project, the process, and why he feels Mabel's image will serve as a very important and positive inspiration. So thank you for joining us, Gary.
Oh, thanks, Pam. Thanks very much. And if you can hear me and you can see me, then we're good to go. Thanks, Lauren. Just like Lauren, all of this for me goes back to Gil's books, Devil in the Grove and Beneath the Ruthless Sun. And after the first book came out, my wife Nancy and I invited Gil to speak in Mount Dora at the community building, and we had an overflow crowd. More than 600 people came out to listen to Gil. And when we brought him back again after Beneath the Ruthless Sun came out, and when Gil was telling a story about Mabel and her courage, and when she had an attorney agree to work pro bono to get Jesse Daniels, this mentally challenged 19-year-old, get him released from the insane asylum in Chattahoochee where Sheriff McCall had put him. They were going into the courtroom, Mabel and the attorney now is having to come face to face with Willis McCall. And he tells Mabel, he goes, "I'm kind of scared of this guy." And she says, "Well, then stand behind me." And to me, that was extraordinary. And I started thinking, and I'll put this together, about Harry Truman after he left the presidency. Someone asked him, "Are you upset that there's no statue of you in Independence, Missouri?" And Harry Truman said, "I'd rather have people ask why there isn't a statue of me than why there is." And so I started thinking about Mabel and thinking, why isn't there a statue of Mabel? And as I started looking into this, I learned that fewer than 10% of all sculptures in America are dedicated to women, fewer than 10%. And so the wheels started to turn. And a friend of myself and my wife, Nancy, is Jim McNallis, who's a renowned sculptor. And he only takes commissions where people, he says, where they project nobility of the human spirit. So on the level of Martin Luther King, who he sculpted, Aung San Suu Kyi of Burma, who he sculpted, Robert F. Kennedy. Well, he agreed to take on this commission to sculpt a portrait of Mabel Norris Reese. And if we can bring up some of those images, Mary, if I can't, all I see right now on my screen is Pam, and here we go. So you'll see where it started, this sculpting process. It started with a 50-pound bag of clay, and that's Jim McNallis in the upper right-hand side working on Mabel in terracotta. And you can see all the pictures behind Jim that were provided by Cindy Chesley Erickson, who is Mabel's granddaughter. The initial terracotta piece was unveiled last January, a year ago, January, before the pandemic. And then we recently had the bronze piece, and that's on the bottom right, completed. And I'd like you to look closely at a few things. Jim was trying to capture courage. He was trying to figure out, we know what a nose looks like. We know what eyes and lips and ears look like, but what does courage look like? And in this, I hope you agree that Jim really captured Mabel's courage to stand up to this bully and threats against her life. She's wearing those trademark bebop glasses that Gilbert King writes about. the strand of pearls. But the most important thing, I think, is if you look at that brooch on her left, just below her left lapel, when Jim was putting the sculpted piece together, Cindy went to his studio, and Jim had asked her to bring something of Mabel's, of her grandmother's, assuming that she would be the caretaker of Mabel's possessions. And so he's thinking, it could be a spool of thread, it could be whatever it is. Well, Cindy just blew Jim's socks off, because she arrives with that little white dot in that brooch. That's the margin release key from Mabel's typewriter. And Jim incorporated that into the sculpted piece. So that is really extraordinary. And the MR for Mabel Reese, or margin release, it was kismet. And another thing that was incorporated into this sculpted piece is that Jim asked me if I knew where Mabel lived, where the Ku Klux Klan had bombed her house twice, where they had burned a cross in her yard. And I checked the county records. I found out where she had lived, and I found a bag of, I went to the house, and at Jim's request, I scooped out a little bag of dirt, and I sent it to Jim. He mixed that in with the clay, and that's all within that sculpted piece. So when you touch it, you're touching Mabel's home. And I think that's just a nice piece. So now, if we can go to the next slides, through fundraising at remembermabel.com, we've raised about $16,000, $17,000. And so that paid for Jim's commission, which, by the way, he gave to the Burmese Children's Medical Fund. Every penny of his commission is helping kids now around the world in Burma, which just almost brings me to tears. We were also able to purchase this pedestal on the left-hand side. That's a mock-up that you'll see of the plaque that's ready to be affixed to the pedestal. We had that plaque bronzed as well, so that will be on display. And on the right-hand side, you'll see the place where it's going to go. That's right by the Chamber of Commerce on the corner of 3rd and Alexander Fourth and Alexander in downtown Mount Dora. It's a high traffic area. And where that sign is, we'll have the foundation, and we'll put the pedestal and the plaque and the bronze sculpture right there. And we'll have the website, remembermabel.com, below it, so people can just go on their phone and learn more about Mabel. And speaking of the website, we're still raising funds for the foundation where the pedestal will rest upon. So if you'd like to go to remembermabel.com, there's a link to the GoFundMe page that you can make a donation. And we're trying to raise about $1,200 to $1,500 more dollars. So if anybody can pitch in, that would be great. And it doesn't end here, because I think the sculpture in things like this just sort of raise the level of awareness about Mabel. And we have to ask ourselves, what would we do in a situation like that if we were having somebody bomb our house or kill our dog or threaten our daughters and that sort of thing? Well, we can look at Mabel, and hopefully this sculpture will be here for decades and will be an inspiration for young ladies, especially young ladies who are so underrepresented in public art, and women who want a role model to follow. That'll be nice. And this will get things started. This is just the first step. Someone mentioned to me recently, why isn't there a school named after Mabel Norris Reese? And there's a Robert E. Lee School in Orange County. There's a Stonewall Jackson School. Well, we could flip a name around and call it a Mabel Norris Reese junior high or middle school. And we have some ladies attending today who have been trying to get Mabel inducted into the Florida Women's Hall of Fame. And so if you go to Remember Mabel, you'll see an account of their efforts and what they're doing to make this happen. So a lot of people are behind this amazing woman, and we just keep pressing forward to bring. It'll be a great day when more people recognize Mabel Norris Reese than recognize Kim Kardashian.
That's quite a comparison. I'll have to think about that one a minute.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gary, for sharing.
Sure.
That was a very informational few minutes. I'll have to think about a lot of that. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure.
It is really astounding to think about naming, and I will say that there are some initiatives percolating locally about renaming of places. And so it's interesting that you mentioned that maybe that's something that should become a reality for Miss Mabel Norris Reese. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. If you have questions for Gary, please put those in the chat. We'll have a few at the end. Next, I would like to introduce Miss Jackie Brockington. She's a former longtime News 13 anchor who's very active in the League of Women Voters and other community groups. She first came to Orlando in 1986 to work for WESH TV. Over the years, she's seen many changes and challenges in local news, including the inclusion of minorities, the struggle of women, especially, and finds even more reasons why local news is so important in comparison to, I shouldn't say in comparison, but in parallel to all the things that were happening during Mabel's time. So thank you, Jackie. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be included on this panel. And I have to say, along with Lauren, I have to confess, after being a journalist for over 30 years, I was not familiar with Mabel Norris Reese. But in doing my research, I'd like to label her as a truth seeker and a woman of integrity. I think it should be required reading for the up and coming journalists, especially women that we have. And while I did have to go through, a segregation period, I never had to go through what Mabel did. There was no cross ever burned. My animals were not poisoned. My house was not burned. And when I think of that, I liken it to I'm where I am today because of a woman like Mabel Norris, who has paved the way. And she was so principled. And I think that's one of the things as a journalist that we try to do always. We try to tell the news with the facts. And that's exactly what Mabel tried to do. I mean, she went to the sheriff, for goodness sakes, who was overseeing everything. And you would think he would have given her the correct information. And when we likewise go to experts and get their, the information, we think we're getting the right information. And in her digging a little bit further, she found out that that was not the case. I mean, in the Groveland Four, the sheriff had killed 2 of the young men while they were in his custody. And so it's important for us to not just take everything as we've learned from her on face value, but while we may get the information from our local officials or whatever, it's always good to do your due diligence and to go a little bit further to make sure that the information that we're being given is actually the truth and the right information. And especially media has such media can change a person's way of thinking, and we're so instrumental when people turn on that box, that television, and hear the words that are coming out of our mouth and, take it as gospel. We want to make sure that what we're trying to, let people know about, that we have done our due diligence and that it really, is what we're saying that it is. And I know when I started back in the 70s, and I started in Green Bay, Wisconsin, my then husband at the time was playing for the NFL team there. There were no Blacks in Green Bay except when the team came to town. And when I was given the opportunity to go on air, there were no, Black women doing any sort of media in Wisconsin, especially in Green Bay, except for one player who did the sports. And when he went home to California, he continued to do the sports. And so people had never seen anybody like me on the air. And of course, as you might expect, we got some negative reaction to that. And so those are some of the challenges, that I had to face. And it's almost like as women, we have to work harder, do more to prove that we can do the job and give you the information that needs to be. And in my career, having to fight for everything, even down to your hair, and now more African-American women journalists, and I see it on Facebook all the time. Can I wear my own hair? Can I do this? As if that's not, if we don't do it, we can't give you the information, that you need. And so just fighting for that, fighting to be heard, fighting to be recognized and taken seriously. And when I think of somebody like, Mabel Norris Reese, the things that she had to do to get the word out. And she was saying, I'm going to tell the truth no matter what. And in my time, none of us had to go through that no matter what. We had to fight, our own battles, but not to the extent that she did. And I was just so impressed by what I learned, and to find out that hardly anybody knew about her. And like Gary said, more people knew about the Kardashians than they knew about Mabel Norris Reese. And so that in itself goes to show you that we still, as women, have to really still go that extra mile to make sure that what we've gone through, and to get the stories out, and to make sure that what's the public knows what's going on. We still have a lot of work to do, and this is 2021. And unfortunately, in 2021, racism is still alive and well. Whereas back in the day, they wore sheets. Today, they wear three-piece suits. You never know who you're being confronted with. And I always like to say, I would rather somebody get in my face and tell me what they think of me, rather than hiding behind some words or a three-piece suit, or thank goodness I was not prone to seeing a sheet and being terrorized like that. And so I'm so fortunate that I've been able to speak to schools and other young women to let them know that, there are those that have gone before us that have made it so that we have a platform to speak, to share. And I'm just so privileged to be able to do that, and to have come through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and to see the progression of women as we get our due. Still a long way to go. As Gary said, what statues in the United States, less than 10%. And there have been some magnificent women who have contributed to the culture of the United States. And where are they? You know what I mean? And so I just, I applaud Mabel. I mean, I just feel so grateful to her for what she had to go through. Could I have done it? Not sure I could have, and that's why it's so important for women to know the history of women, so that we know in whatever way that they influenced us, whether it's in the media, the theater, or what, we know what we have contributed to the United States and to our history. So I'm just so proud that I was given the opportunity to do work in the media. I hope I've made a small difference. As I said, I like to talk to people and to young people to let them know. But I, for one, am going to really tell people about, Mabel Norris Reese, to let them know that this was a woman of integrity, a truth fighter, and a woman of principle. And I'm just glad to have been here to share just a little bit about, what I've gone through. So thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Jackie. And I think you've been your trailblazer in your own way, faced with different circumstances. And so we certainly honor you, and you're singing my song. We do need to know women's history so that we can keep those things in mind and sort of push forward harder. Women do seem to have to work harder, and it's a good thing we're up to that challenge. So thank you so much for sharing, Jackie. Again, anybody who has questions for Jackie or other speakers, please do share those in the chat, and we'll come back around to those. I do want to introduce our next individual who we are so honored really to have her join us. And we've asked her to say a few minutes, though we didn't ask her in advance. So she's flying by the seat here. But we're so honored to introduce and welcome Cindy Chesley Erickson. Cindy's the granddaughter of Mabel Norris Reese, so we're so lucky to have her here. She lives in Ormond Beach. Something we'd share that the sculptor that Gary shared, Jim McNallis, he really credits Cindy with making it possible to capture the likeness of Reese. He said, "I could not have pulled this off without Cindy's input. Cindy brought her alive for me and showed me who she was." And I love that. So Cindy, we would love to have you say something for a few minutes.
Well, thank you. I'm really honored y'all asked me to participate. It doesn't look like I'm on. I'm assuming I am. Yep, I saw a question in the chat that I'm going to go ahead and answer, because I was actually going to speak to that. And they asked how my grandmother's life in Ohio affected what she did. And one of the stories that I remember my grandmother telling was that she went straight out of high school to be a reporter for I think it was called the Akron Beacon Journal. And they asked her as a young reporter to take a Black female spelling bee contestant to the National Spelling Bee in Washington, D.C. So my grandmother took the train with this young girl from Ohio to Washington, D.C., and saw firsthand what this poor young girl had to go through, where she wasn't allowed to stay in the same motel. She saw the different bathrooms. The girl had to be in a different train car. And that was actually my grandmother's first exposure to the blatant racism that, you know, she never, as a young white girl in Ohio, would have ever thought about until she had to do that. And that's really what got her fired up. And I think that's what made her willing to move to Florida with my grandfather and buy the Mount Dora Topic, was because she knew about the Jim Crow laws, and she knew how hard it was, that, and a lot of white women especially didn't see that, never thought about that, because we're talking, this was in the late 30s, early 40s that she did this. And I'm so honored by what everybody has said about my grandmother today. And it still amazes me that people think what she did was so special, when growing up, to me, she was just Graham. And it never occurred to me that a woman in the 50s wouldn't do the things she did. And now that, you know, I look back, I realize, dear God, that woman had more courage than I have ever had. And the fact that she was willing to do what she did, and someone mentioned place her family in danger to do what was right. I just thought everybody's grandmother did that. I mean, didn't yours? So I thank her every day. I thank God every day that I grew up with such a wonderful, strong role model, that it never occurred to me any time in my life that I couldn't do whatever it is I wanted to do, because my grandmother did, and fought lots of battles that lots of women never did, so that now we today can fight different battles. One last thing I want to throw in there that really struck me, Carl Hiaasen, the reporter, the editorial writer, whatever, from the Miami Herald, just retired, and he wrote his last opinion piece. And one of the things he mentioned was the demise of local journalism has allowed so many things to happen that fly under the radar, that we don't have the reporters out there reporting on. He's talking about how the developers have taken over lands that people would normally fight. And I think that's really happened with a lot of the racism and things that we see, is that our local papers are just have such little money, and they've laid off so many people, that we are not getting the journalism that we grew up with out there talking about everything that's going on and calling people's attention to it. And I hate the fact that journalists are so demoralized now with what's going on with journalism. And I personally, every time I get an invite to get a subscription to a paper, I do it. I subscribe to the Orlando Sentinel, I subscribe to the Daytona Beach News Journal, I subscribe to the New York Times, the Washington Post, because they need our support. And of course, I have to do that in my grandmother's memory. So thank you, everybody, for being here today and for letting me speak.
Thank you so much for joining us and sharing those personal, intimate stories. I always love that, and I appreciate, because it really helps the person feel more real, right? It's not just this story and history, and we should all not only know women's history, but we should know our own women's history.
Yes.
Lots of women put in a lot of hard work to bring any of us, woman, man, or otherwise, to where we are today. So thank you for sharing, Cindy.
Thank you for asking me.
And last but not least, we would like to introduce our final speaker, Gloria Pickard, co-president of the League of Women Voters of Orange County. She's also a nursing clinician, educator, and author of 2 nursing textbooks, who holds a doctorate in higher education administration from the University of Florida. A consultant with businesses and universities about online learning best practices. She's been named 6 times to the list of top 50 women-led businesses in Florida. Organizational leadership and coalition building are her passions, and we are so honored to welcome you today, Gloria.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, sure. The League of Women Voters of Orange County is honored to partner with the Orange County Regional History Center on this Women's History Month event. You know, we have a long and deep relationship with the center. We are grateful that the center is also our league's archivist. When I became president 3 years ago, I'll never forget hearing from our history committee who developed this relationship that the Orange County Regional History Center was delighted to be our archivist as a repository of our history. They quoted center leadership at the time who noted, quote, "We have lots of men's history here, but not much women's history." And here we are again today, the second year of this important event during this important month. Beginning in 1984, women got a whole week to recognize women's history. And since 1995, US presidents have issued proclamations designated March as Women's History Month. Women have changed the course of US history. We all know that. They have led civil rights movement and fought to abolish slavery. They were among the first to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. They fought for legislation to gain the right to vote. And they have been great American novelists and held power to account as investigative journalists, like the noble and courageous woman we recognize today, Mabel Norris Reese. Women have not only penetrated the glass ceiling, gaining hard-fought top seats in government and business, and holding up truth to power, they have also begun to crack the bronze ceiling. As Gary pointed out, fewer than 500 of more than 5,000 commemorative monumental statues in our country are of women. Why, just last August, New York City's famous Central Park unveiled monument statues of Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, three women's rights pioneers. These are three well-known women suffragists to women like the League. But the real story about these bronze statues is that they were also the very first monumental women statues in Central Park, where heretofore stood 23 historic figures, but not a single woman. Only fictional women were represented, like Juliet from Romeo and Juliet, Alice in Wonderland, and Mother Goose, but not a single real serious woman. And we are hopeful that this July, Florida will finally replace a Confederate general as one of our two statues in the US Capitol's Statuary Hall with a woman for the first time, the very woman this event honored last year, Mary Bethune-Cookman. I point all of this out to echo congratulations to Mount Dora for recognizing Mabel Norris Reese for investigative journalism against racism and injustice and defense of the free press with our democracy with the terracotta bust by Florida sculptor Jim McNallis to create his tribute to this remarkable Pulitzer Prize nominee small town journalist. And congratulations for plans to install a bronze version of the bust near the Mount Dora Chamber of Commerce building this year. Another crack in that bronze ceiling. If you'll indulge me another minute, I want to tell you more about the League and our League in particular. We're one of the oldest leagues in the nation, actually the oldest in Florida, and we believe the largest in Florida and possibly the largest in the US. This is our 81st year and the 101st year of the League of Women Voters nationally. 2020 was a big year for the League, with the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage and the monumental presidential election that was still challenged until January 6th. We all know that recent history. And of course, the pandemic and the racism reckoning of 2020. The mission of the League and each of the more than 700 local leagues nationwide is simple: empower voters, defend democracy. Our value statement attests to the importance of women in defending our democracy. It simply states the power of women to create a more perfect democracy. I always say that our country would be more civil and civilized if women occupied at least 50% of the senior leadership roles at all levels of government, business, and industry. While we were founded to give women the right to vote, we do much more than that today. As a nonpartisan organization, meaning we neither support nor oppose elected officials or candidates for office, we do take positions and educate the public on issues that we study. Many people in our community look to the League before voting on local charter or state constitutional amendments. We are advocates for voting rights, natural resources, renewable energy, public education, juvenile justice, racial equity, COVID vaccinations, Medicaid expansion, improved public transportation, and many, many more. But one issue that is top of our list is protection of our First Amendment right to a free press. This is how we maintain a balance of power in government in this country. Just as the vote is fundamental to our democracy, the League knows that the free press and journalists like Mabel Norris Reese, who investigate and report about our society, both good and bad, guarantee we are all informed voters. Thank you for joining this monumental event today. And thank you for allowing the League of Women Voters of Orange County to co-sponsor it with you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. All right, well, I haven't seen any questions I don't think have been addressed in the chat. So if you have them, please do drop them now while we're giving time for everybody to do that. I just want to take a moment to really thank each of our sponsors. Our sponsor, Universal Orlando, and each of our speakers. We're so honored to be able to include everybody and to just share, honestly, just minutes of the incredible knowledge and stories that each of these individuals hold on their own. We do have a lot of different options for giving. We mentioned a few at the beginning. Of course, last year, we really were able to kick off the Her Story, Women in History internship in honor of Jean Evans and Bickley Wilson. So we've had dropped in the chat a link where you can give to that for just $2,500. No amount is too small, but for $2,500, you can sponsor one entire internship for somebody to get experience and to work towards bringing these narratives up to the surface. And so that's one option. You can also give towards making the statue of Mabel Norris Reese happen. And we also have the United Arts campaign going on. That's a local campaign. And right now gifts are being matched up to 30%. So we've dropped that link as well if that's a preference for how you might like to give. And if not to the History Center, think of your local arts organization. It's been a challenging year for all of us, and do consider any gift. Again, no gift is ever too small for any of our local cultural and historical institutions. So please consider these different opportunities, whether you are interested in funding education through the internship fund or the sculpture of Mabel Norris Reese, or just more of a general gift to the History Center. We welcome that, and we thank you all for coming. I do want to also mention on top of that we've made bookmarks. If you came last year, we had these really beautiful bookmarks, and we'll be sending those out to you as well. Just because we can't meet in person doesn't mean that we don't want you to have that memento of our appreciation and our encouragement to go out and keep making history and telling others about it as well. So thank you again so much for coming. I don't see any additional questions. We appreciate all of you. We hope you stay safe and well. And we look forward to having you join us in person for the third event next year.